I will now switch to English to introduce our guest speaker, the keynote speaker of this conference, my good friend and colleague from the United States, Robin Fretwell Wilson. She's the Associate Dean for Public Engagement and the Roger and Stephany Joslin Professor of Law at the University of Illinois College of Law. She is the author of no less than 11 books, and she has been ranked among the top 10 family law scholars in the United States for scholarly impact in each ranking done by the Leiter Report since 2010. I wonder what would happen if we had such a ranking here in Israel. It's really imposing. She also directs the University of Illinois College of Law's Epstein Health Law and Policy Program and its Family Law and Policy Program. Professor Wilson also founded and directs the Tolerance Means Dialogues and the Fairness for All initiative, both which are made possible with private philanthropic support. And if I can say something in addition to that, this is something that really characterizes Professor Wilson's work, this connection between academia and impact and activism. And for all those who are interested, now I'm doing some promotion for next week. On Sunday afternoon, we will have an informal meeting with Professor Wilson exactly on these topics of what she calls translational law, translating the work done in academia into effective impact, as we say in Hebrew, on the ground. בשטח, כן? So it promises to be very, very interesting and, of course, very, very relevant to what we do here in Israel. In addition, she also chairs the Substance Abuse Disorder Working Group of the System-Wide Institute of Government and Public Affairs at the University of Illinois and is a founding member of the Genomic Security and Privacy theme of the Carl Woese Institute for Genomic Biology at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She is a member of the American Law Institute, which is probably the highest law institute in the United States, working on specific bills throughout the federal system. And a Fulbright specialist. She has 3 times been honored for her work with lawmakers on innovative laws. And she is the guest of the Rackman Center and the Bar-Ilan Faculty of Law for this week, teaching a course on bioethics. And we are really very, very fortunate that she agreed to participate, to take part in our conference today and give a talk from the perspective, from the US perspective, 100 years ago to current days, contemporary feminist battles in the United States. So without further ado, Robin, the floor is all yours.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I am deeply grateful. Those of you, well, I'm sure everyone here knows Ruth, and when Ruth asks you to do something, the easiest natural answer always to give is yes, because she's been a wonderful collaborator and partner, and it's an absolute privilege to be spending time with you. So I want to talk about the progress that women have made in the United States. We take it down. I want to talk about the progress that women have made in the United States. And one of the things that I think is very important with any issue that's difficult in society is to both credit how far we've come, but then also to critique how much farther we have to go and why precisely that is. And I thought I would lend some of that or give some impressions of that progress as well as how far we have to go by focusing on my mother. I know how important mothers are in your society. My last trip to Israel, my mother was with me. And my mother is the person on the right, and my grandmother is also featured here. And you'll see in a moment why I have really focused on them, because across 3 generations, my grandmother, my mother, and myself, you can see a snapshot of what has happened in the United States. My grandmother was actually alive at the time that we were enacting the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. So I'll come back to that. As I said, I think it's really important to focus on how far we've come, so I'm going to start there. And I'm just going to give you a brief timeline. You can see here that we had the 19th Amendment not so long before the Great Depression, so there was a lot of economic hardship. And then the Great Depression ends a decade later, and most importantly, we see the rise of women taking jobs in connection with World War II. So as so many men were away fighting, there was opportunity in the industries to take paid positions. Some of those were then yielded back to men when they came back from the war, but nonetheless, women had the opportunity to work. Very early on, people forget this, that President Kennedy signed into law in 1963, which is stunning, an Equal Pay Act. I'll show you in a second, we don't get anything close to equal pay, but at least the principle was there in 1963. And then I just picked one other marker, really from the Obama administration, also on the question of equal pay, but an important piece of legislation that President Obama signed into place called the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which was a procedural fix allowing women to bring claims for equal pay in a longer period of time, because frequently they wouldn't know until much, much later that they in fact had not been paid the same amount. I'll come back to this timeline in just a second. So then I think it's important to look at the rise of workplace participation by women. So this chart will show you the blue bars are the percent of women in the overall workforce, and then the orange or red bar is the percent of men in the overall workforce. And you can see a steady rise and a leveling off of women in the workforce. We're going to talk about why some of that is in a second. We also know that it can be hard sometimes for women to balance their own family lives with workplace participation. And you see this here, you see this with mothers who are in the workplace at really every age level. So with the youngest children, obviously the least number of women, smaller fraction of women participating in the workplace. As those children get older, that number is higher, so you'll see the bulk of women participating. But it's leveled off in interesting ways in recent years. Now, we also have to think about women as breadwinners in their own families. You can see here at the bottom, the darker green, that in many families in the United States, women are the only wage earner because those children live only with their mothers. But even where we have intact two-parent families, we have a rising share of women and mothers who are actually the primary wage earner. They're earning more than their partner or their husband or their wives if it was a same-sex couple. And I said something about pay equity, so let me show you where we are on that. So since the time that President Kennedy signed that early law into place, women were paid about 6/10 of what men were paid. And now that has come to something like 8/10. It's going to be really interesting to watch, and I'll show you in just a moment, that this pay equity charge may be led by, of all people, the women's soccer team. I'm going to show you that in just a second. Our women's soccer players are incredibly talented and crushing it, getting paid less, by the way, than the men, and I'll come back to that in just a second. Now, the other thing that we've seen is that we have a shifting set of expectations, especially among younger people, millennials and Generation Z, about whether they are going to get a fair shot in the workplace, and whether they are interested in taking leadership roles. And so you can see here from this 2016 survey of college-educated women who are working at companies that, more than half aspire to have leadership roles eventually, and expectations are matching those aspirations. I think that's really important. So let me put a little bit of flesh on this with my mother and my grandmother. So this is my grandmother I told you on the left and my mother on the right. And I've taken the same timeline because I was sort of intrigued to look at their histories alongside mine, and I laid it on top. So my grandmother was born before we had the right to vote as a set of people. She started teaching, actually after the suffrage, right, but before the Great Depression. I'll show you something about that in a second. My mother's then later born. She's one of 8 children, one of whom died in childbirth, so a very large family. Notwithstanding that, my grandmother actually was one of the early women to work. She had a significant career at a department store called Montgomery Ward's. I'll show you that in just a second. And that helped her and my grandfather, who was a dairy farmer, be able to have such a large family and to live a very modest life. My mother was a nurse in the military, in the Air Force. That's how she met my father. She stopped out of work for a period of time while my sister and I were small. But then, very important to our family, in 1979, she took a position. I'll show you something about that in a second. And that was a time when my father, who was a welder, was in a significant industrial accident just after my mother started working. And he was in the burn unit for 42 days. So that gives you some sense of how significant it was. And my mother, in very short order, ended up carrying my family through a significant crisis. And then the two, he survived for another 10 years. The two together are supporting the family. And then at the end of her career, I'll show you how she ends up faring. But she retired only some years ago, before the trip that we took, in fact, to Israel together. Okay? So this is the schoolhouse that my grandmother taught at in Minot, North Dakota. So one-room schoolhouse. She was a teacher at 19. This was a time when women really had very few options other than to teach, frankly, as careers. I remember when I received my first chair at Washington Ali, I'll show you that in a second, that some of the people in the boat club, the yacht club that I was a member of, they had a party. And a lot of the women who were only 10 or 15 years older than me had told me how they went to college and had taken teaching degrees. And just think about how much different their life might have been if it was only so many years later, like within a generation, having so much more opportunity open to them. But this was very good for my grandmother in terms of being able to care for herself before she was married. And then I told you that during her family with my grandfather, she worked at Montgomery Ward's. And she sold tires. It turns out my grandmother was pretty gifted at selling things. There were farmers who literally would not buy tires from anyone else besides Myrtle Sweet. That's just how it went. And she made a career of that. She literally worked there until, she was of a normal retirement age. And so that was a very significant thing. This is the medical school that my mother started at before my father was burned, literally within months before he was burned. And she started out as a clerk typist too, which probably doesn't mean anything to you, but it was a secretarial position. It was literally the lowest you could start at this school without being on the janitorial staff, literally. And that has been repeated to me many times when I was growing up. My sister and I almost weirdly grew up at this medical school because my father was hospitalized, and it turns out it was across the street from the hospital where my dad spent a lot of time. At the end of my mother's career, 35 years later, she retired as the assistant dean for faculty affairs because she has this incredible ability to keep like 1,500 people straight in her mind. You could meet people randomly, and my mother could rattle off their CV, tell you when they got tenure, helped many of these people get tenure, because, she could just organize big amounts of information. Now, that was a really significant job that I think today she would not be able to get, because at the time she had a 2-year secretarial sciences degree. When they went to replace my mother, they wanted people with a master's degree or a PhD. So if you were like my mother and you were a first-generation college and taking a 2-year degree, you could not have this happen to you today. I really honestly believe that. So there's a sort of sense of a moment when women were coming into the workforce where they could power themselves through to significant opportunity by simply being really talented and really good, okay? Now I think there's a much more premium on education. Now I'll just include myself for just a second to kind of give you a sense of like how much, in some sense, so much more opportunity open to me simply by being born one generation later. So I started my teaching career at a school called the University of South Carolina. I moved to a University of Maryland, which had a very accomplished health law program, very good move for me. Went to a small liberal arts college that had a single graduate program, the law school at Washington and Lee, and then now I'm at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. Now that's a lot of movement. I'm not a job hopper. I'm older than I look. But in any event, it was a tremendous amount of mobility, especially if you have a family, because, you know, at least for part of this time, I'm divorced, but for part of this time, you're having to negotiate that with the trailing spouse. And family form is actually, I'm going to show you in just a second, affecting a lot of the ability of women to compete even today. Okay? Make sense so far? Okay. And your stories all look like this, by the way. You could have told the exact same story with your grandmother or mother, right? Okay. So this is, by the way, I was just here in Miami, and so I took this picture, and I realized that the horizon actually was a really good image for where we need to go. And we got to get to the end, way over there. And I'm going to talk about the things that are still in front of us and trying to get there. Pay equity. Women are, in fact, paid less. I showed you a slide. I'm going to show you how difficult it is to overcome that. Workplace opportunity. We talk a lot about glass ceilings. It's not going to be the glass ceiling that's really the problem. It's the first rung. I'm going to show you that. We're seeing this show up in education. I'm going to give you one example from West Point and the entering class at West Point. And then I have some personal work of mine, and I'm going to talk about it as long as it seems to make sense, so I'll cut myself off at one point or another. But at the very least, I want to show you about ways in which we're disrespecting women's autonomy over their bodies in medical teaching, something that I don't think is confined to the United States, and let me make that clear. We are teaching pelvic exams to medical students with women who are under anesthesia for surgery without asking them. I think that's wrong. I think it's incredibly deep disrespect of women and their agency. And I'm going to show you how we're changing the law in the United States to rectify that. And then if we have, so that was about the body, and then if we have time, I'll talk a little bit about families and ways that I think we're stepping over women's wishes as to what should happen with their children at the time of breakup in ways that are significant, but only if we have time, okay? So how are we doing on time, by the way? I didn't bring my phone up. 20. Perfect. Okay. So this is the women's soccer team. I don't know if anybody's been watching them. They're crushing the world. Great. But we are paying them less, and not just a little bit less. So they actually have led the charge in the United States for equal pay. And they filed a class action against the U.S. Soccer Federation in particular. And one thing that's incredibly helpful here is that the Equal Pay Act and these other things that say you should be paid equal are for the same job. And often the difficulty becomes whether you can show that you're in fact performing the same job for less money. But this is easy. These guys are performing the same job. In fact, they're competing nationally. And the women on the women's soccer team get $260,000 for winning the World Cup. The dudes, if they won it, right, would get 1.1 million, and that's a lot more. The women are paid on salaries, but the men are paid on bonuses. Now, sometimes salary can be a better deal for you than bonuses, but notwithstanding that, if the women had been paid bonuses, even on the same scale that the men, that they would have gotten another $540,000. The men, for example, in their first World Cup game, get a bonus that's twice the size of the women's, just for qualifying. Now, what's that mean? It means that the men are earning more with these bonuses, even if they don't perform as well as the women, than the women are with salary when they won the entire world. And that has led them to certify a class action. And that class action status was granted recently, which actually makes this a much more valuable lawsuit and gets people's attention. And they're basically asking for three things in that class action. They want an injunction so that this thing isn't happening anymore. They want punitive damages for the fact that they have actually not been paid what the men have been paid. And then finally, they want equal pay under the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is in theory what the Equal Pay Act guaranteed them already. Now, we also have seen not only an equity in pay for, in that case, exactly the same job, but we have not seen equal opportunity in the workplace. Now, here I think we have to be very careful not to overstate, and I'm going to come back to Family Forum in a second. But let me start with some basics. So this is a report that McKinsey & Company, which is a consulting firm, has done about sort of the pipeline. You've seen these images in other ways. I'm focusing on the third one down, which is white women, just as one indicator. But you can see that as you progress from the entry level to manager to vice president to senior vice president to the C-suite, i.e. you're the CEO, the CFO, or whatever of the company, that pipeline is going down to a small number. Now, the 18% that we've seen in the last year of women in the C-suite, in one sense, sounds good because it's a 29% jump over a prior time when this was looked at. So you'd think, oh, a third more. But we have to be cautious even here because that's still just one woman for every 5 people at the very top of a corporation. Now, a lot of folks talk about glass ceilings. There's actually some really interesting new work that suggests that the problem isn't really some ceiling that you hit. The problem is at the get-go, the very first rung, that you start climbing the ladder. And we see that women are actually holding those early positions to a far smaller degree than men. So they don't even get to climb up the ladder because they didn't get to the first rung. And now, women disproportionately believe they're being judged by different standards. I don't know whether they are or not. I'm actually not interested in the merits for this point that I'm making. What I want to show you is that the dudes don't believe that. Men don't believe this to the same degree at all. But some of the human resource managers, in other words, the people inside of the company who should be most acutely aware of opportunity, their views of this actually starts to approximate what women think, which makes me think that it might be a problem. Now, one argument that you might have made during my grandmother's era, or my mother's, but probably not today, is that there aren't enough qualified women to bump up the ladder to these, more elevated, difficult positions. Certainly women are not buying that, right? Half of the women think, no, there's plenty of, qualified people. The HR managers don't believe that. So that may tell you that something within the firm is broken in terms of getting on that first rung. And then the men falling far shorter in the terms of, whether there are really enough qualified women. Now, one thing I think is really significant, and we talk about in law schools, as I'm sure you do here, is mentoring. And the word that's being used in this literature is sponsorship. And HR managers are disproportionately saying, look, it's the sponsorship, it's the person pulling you up to that first rung that's so crucial. And there's this interesting piece that's by Melissa Ardebain about the sponsorship muscle. What she basically means is what's happening in that picture over there. A senior man taking an interest in a younger man because he sees something of himself in the younger man. Now, we know that this happens with women. I actually have, maybe for the first time, second time in my life, a very significant person at my university system who's taken an interest in me. And I think Ruth told you that I was directing a substance use disorder group. That's this woman saying, oh, Wilson might be the right person for this legislative work. She took an interest in knowing me, and because she knew me, she could slot me into something they needed. Okay? That's the sponsorship muscle. Now, that should happen with women to the same degree that it happens with men, but it doesn't. For some reason, it does not, the literature suggests. Now, we have compounding this a different set of problems. One is in education, and I'll just give you give you West Point as an example. And that's that, you know, women aren't even getting to the starting gate at West Point. So women, for example, make up less than 20% of all the class at West Point. Now, you might say women are taking themselves out of the pool, right? They don't want to go to West Point. It's very difficult. And I know some people who have gone to West Point and some people who went and left because it's difficult. It wasn't for them. But that doesn't seem to be the case. I'll show you that in a second. But in any event, when they come, they're qualified and they're crushing it. Right? So 8 of 10 top graduates last year were women, right? And 44% of the people on the honor code, the honor roll, were women. Now, this is not a political problem. And what I mean by that is you, to even get to West Point, have to have a nomination from a member of Congress. So you might say only the men are asking to be nominated. But what we're really seeing is that since 1994, only about 27% of all the nominations have been women. And the Democrats are as bad on this as the Republicans. They're all just sort of nominating men, or large numbers of men. And that's limiting the opportunity of women in this one very specific place. Now, you could do marketing. You could pull more women into the pool and a stronger pool of women to compete with the men. And we've seen some of that being helped last year. So there was a 40% increase by overall in applications to West Point. That led to a 50% increase in women. So this is a very important way to attack the problem. But still, the most recently admitted class only bumped up to 24%. So a huge spike in interest, a tiny increase in yield. So I think women need equal access, especially to this institution, because it's sponsored by all of us with tax dollars. And one possible fix that's been proposed, this is not mine, would be, for example, to make sure that members of Congress have to annually report on that pool of people that they're actually giving that very crucial nomination to. That might rectify some of this. Now, one place where I have some trouble in the recent literature, and I just don't know what to make of it, so I'll be interested in what you have to say, is this idea that women lack confidence and that men have too much of it. Now, I just have never understood confidence as something that you have too much of generally. You know, if you're not competent to fly a plane and you feel overconfident about that, that's a problem. I understand that. But generally, I don't know that you can have too much. So I'm skeptical about the next couple of points. But one thing that we're seeing in the literature is that in particular in the interview process, women will tend to discount their abilities. Whereas men will tend to be like, oh, I'm 100% qualified. They'll go after every job and they'll project that, okay? And that's across large groups. No offense to the men who are here listening. It's across large groups. So some of what's been said, and this is one place where I'm deeply skeptical, is that there's this claim that that companies need to do a better job of giving people realistic expectations, and then this is the line that's difficult for me, that the best way to close that gap is to make men less confident. Now, that doesn't strike me as the right way to go. What strikes me as the right way to go is to make women confident in their skills so that they, are adequately and accurately, understanding where they fall in the scheme. Something I think I can understand better would be this, to give people more feedback on the regular so that women hear that they are actually progressing, and then that builds confidence, and then they are more eager to take the next step and to continue up those rungs. Okay. And then we have family. So has been written about on-ramps and off-ramps out of companies, and whether when you leave for a period of time you can come back. So I just picked up one study from what's happening in big law firms, big law in the United States, and child care commitments are basically taking an important impact on women's choices to leave those firms, and they're leaving in fairly significant numbers. And women believe that they're basically given a binary choice, that they can either be a big law partner or they can be a parent. And they don't see the possibility of of combining them. I'm not faulting them for whether they're accurately assessing that. I'm just making a statement of fact. Now, we know that there's a gender gap in child care responsibilities, so this was a survey that basically asked people who in the family was assuming full responsibility for the children. 54% of women said, it's me. 1% of men said that it was them. And this is by their own account. And then you see on the other side of this that when you look at women attorneys, 34% of the women attorneys say, I'm the only parent who's ever left the workplace for a child care reason, i.e. to take my kid home when they were sick. And of the men, the male attorneys, only 4% of them said the same thing. So you're seeing a disproportionate impact. Now, earnings and what's happening in terms of child care and satisfaction in relationships or relationship stress are all sort of mixing, and I'll show you this study. So this was a study of husband stress, depending on where they, how much of the whole couple's earnings they made. So you can see here on the red line at the left, if the man made 100% of the earnings down to 0, and then the woman made 0 up to 100%. So right in the middle where it intersects, they would be making the same amount of money. Make sense? Okay, so what this study found is that women thought that their husband's stress, in terms of financial life stress, would be at the lowest when they earned the same amount of money. That kind of makes sense. But it's not true. And what's really true is that men had a lot of stress when they were the chief earner, and it went down to the ebb when they made 60% and she made 40%. And then after she gets past 40%, their stress starts going back up, which actually sort of tells you that there's a kind of weird competitiveness going on in the family or something going on in the family. Now, also interesting in terms of family dynamic and the relative earning position of people in the same family is something that was later in the same study, talking about the fact that the women misunderstood or misappreciated the stress of the men. And Dr. Joanna Serta said, the fact that a wife observes to a lesser degree her husband's elevated psychological distress because he doesn't make, he's not the biggest wage earner, simply because he doesn't communicate it, is itself sort of gendered. There's like a lot going on in here that people are not picking up on, and they're going to be hard to remove. Okay. Then we have this fellow who recently blew up Twitter by posting this tweet, which was taking the position that, geniuses are overwhelmingly male, and he goes on to give some reasons for why that would be. And this is a very antiquated view, obviously. The students at this university have been moving to try to get this person pushed off the faculty, a kind of cancel culture, which we see a lot of in a lot of contexts. But you're running up to the idea that there's something baked into all of this. And many people, it's surprising when you see a faculty member saying this openly, but I think many, many people believe that somewhere deep. And that's something that's going to persist. Now, how are we doing on time?
Maybe take less than 10 more minutes.
Okay.
So that
Perfect.
We'll have time for Q&A.
Perfect. Then I'm going to talk about this question of women's autonomy to medical teaching. So I'll just spend a second on that. This is some work that I've been doing since really the beginning of my career. I testified about it at the Federal Trade Commission in 2003, worked in getting a handful of laws changed across the United States, thought it was done, problem solved, norm changed, we can move on. Until last November, I get a call on my cell phone from Arizona, and it's a woman who's called me, and she says, I've been admitted to I just woke up from surgery at a hospital in Arizona where she's a nurse. And she is told by the medical resident that they had used the opportunity of her being unconscious to teach a set of medical students how to do pelvic exams. Now, the problem is that she was there for stomach surgery. There's like a lot of distance between your genitals and the stomach. There was absolutely no reason to use her to teach a normal pelvic exam. We have these people that we employ for that called gynecological teaching associates. Like, you could teach normal anatomy with paid volunteers. You don't have to use anesthetized women. You don't actually have to use anesthetized women even to teach, without their consent, even to teach abnormal anatomy, because women in overwhelming numbers, and I show this empirically in my work, will say yes if you ask them. But they sometimes want to limit the number of medical students. They sometimes want to maybe match by gender. Only women, should do this. Now, one of the reasons this was so disturbing is that this woman was a sexual assault survivor when she was a child, 11 years old. A man who had been put in jail. And if you know anything about incest or child sexual abuse in the United States, we don't put people in jail generally. We haven't in the past, which tells me that that was really bad. And yet she's just used in this way as if it wasn't even a thing. Okay? Now, obviously, I'm going to talk about this in the bioethics class this week, so I'm super excited. But there are some standard bioethics reasons why you should ask people for their consent, not least of which is their right to bodily integrity. We have entire doctrines premised on that. The duty to secure informed consent to any medical treatment, for example. Respect for persons says that you should ask, right? And ask yourself, if it was men who were having these exams for urological reasons, like a prostate exam, without asking them how long this would happen, right? If the respect for persons was men, my predictive judgment is this wouldn't be happening without consent. And I'm actually starting a study to try to prove just that. So we'll see whether I'm right, but that's my judgment. Autonomy, obviously, and the ability of self-governance, and trust. Trust. Because if people believe that this is going to happen without their consent in the healthcare context, it changes that doctor-patient relationship. It changes. It's a fiduciary relationship, but you will not feel that your physician is your fiduciary if they're just using you in these ways without asking. So we've been working since this op-ed that I did in the Chicago Tribune, really since January when the legislative sessions across the United States started, to change that in the remaining part of the country. And I'll show you this progress in just a second. And one of the really striking things that's happened since the Chicago Tribune, which didn't happen with the Federal Trade Commission testimony, is that patients have come forward. Now, when I was doing this work a long time ago, in 2003, we had lots of data, no patient. Now we have a patient, not so good data, but it doesn't matter, because the patient's story is so profound. Not only the patient I just showed you, but this woman who showed up at the very first, to testify on behalf of the first law that was enacted to prohibit this without consent this year. And her name is Ashley. So let me play this for you.
I saw all these women stand up to give comment, and I thought, oh good, I'm not going to be the only one who this has happened to. And it has happened to me. My name is Ashley Vates. I'm a trauma survivor and advocate in the community. I'm co-founder of the Trauma Resiliency Collaborative, and I have notes just because this is such a loaded topic. It does happen in Utah. It happened to me in 2004 in a local emergency room. I was not there for any gynecological reason. I was there for nausea and vomiting. The physician, I remember, is very kind and very lovely. And I felt like he cared about what was going on, and that he couldn't treat my nausea and vomiting, and that he couldn't find a reason for it, and he was concerned. And I've read the notes from the visit. And he notes, and I'm going to read the note, I had been seeing this 23-year-old in the emergency department. I had anticipated she would be discharged. However, she persists in having tachycardia and appearing quite nauseated. I treated the patient with some medication. I had held off on Phenergan. It's a very sedating drug. I had held off on IV Phenergan, expecting her to be able to drive home. But at this point, since that is not the case, I gave her Phenergan IV. She has had some improvement in her nausea. She is quite somnolent. I was very asleep. He goes on and says, also there are symptoms. It is unclear the exact cause. I performed a pelvic exam. There's nothing in there about consent, and I know that I didn't give it because I woke up screaming.
It's interesting. Oops, let me pause.
He goes on in his note.
I'll stop there.
I saw all these women stand up.
I can figure out how to stop there. Sorry. Go to the next slide. When this hearing was occurring, you can listen to it live on the internet when the hearing was occurring. Oh, sorry. Yeah, it'll come back, I'm sure. Some technical expertise. Thank you. Oh, I hit escape. Sorry about that. I'm sorry. Shouldn't hit a button. Out of habit.
No?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay.
And let's see. It should be.
Again, duplicate.
Yeah, it's duplicated.
No.
I know, but you have
This
to open,
one.
I think. Okay, that's where it is. Yeah, thank you.
Somebody closed.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, now you have to.
I go. Yeah, I go. No, I hit that again. Sorry about this. I'll just keep keying along. No, I'll just do one more point, which was the map. But you could feel the energy in the room just listening to the testimony and the questions, and there was a deep skepticism before Ashley spoke about whether, one, this factually happens, and two, whether it would matter to anybody because they're unconscious, and so who cares? It doesn't really harm you, and it doesn't leave a physical manifestation. But it's still a violation of a person's dignity not to have been asked. And then after she testified, the committee returned a unanimous vote in behalf of moving that to the floor for dialogue and discussion by the full body. And has anyone here been at the legislature when things have been enacted? Some of us, yeah? Yeah, it's exciting, right? Because you see the vote count, and I'm going to show you the vote count here. All the green votes are yeses. And then the whites were abstentions, basically. And this law, which passed in Utah in the early part of this year, set off a wave. Now, Utah is not always thought of as the most progressive state in America. Just trust me on that. It's not thought of that way. But here we are in Utah. And then, they take what was the pre-existing map, which was some of my earlier work after the Federal Trade Commission, saying, no, you need to ask. And they end up becoming the first state there. And then since, we've had 4 other states, or 3 other states, 4 total in 10 months, say, you have to really ask women for their consent. And then you can see in the gray, so those are the green states, and in the gray states, there have been bills introduced. And so there's actually a wave that's sort of premised to some extent on the idea of Me Too. And we're seeing evolve, and this is a very detailed chart, I apologize for that, but we're seeing actually a sort of new ethos about the way you construct these laws evolve, so that you're regulating not only the medical student, but the attending. And New York's Governor Cuomo just signed into law the last of these this year, and they've actually made it a grounds for professional discipline. And that's one way that you get people's attention, actually. And then, of course, I just will end on this point, just that related to all of this, sort of in the same space, is what's happening with Me Too around my country. And I just picked one barometer of that, which was a report in the last couple of weeks from a cruise line that started talking about all the incidents that get reported on the cruise ship. And the overwhelming majority of it is still, even today, sexual assault. Some by their employees, some by other guests on the ship, right? And then some by unaccounted for people. But it's just sort of stunning when you think about both how far we've come, but then how far we still have to go. And I'll end on that point.
So, thank you so much, Robin. It's been a fascinating account, taking us through both the personal case history of yourself, 3 generations of women. I think it's also a very feminine kind of way to present an historical account through the personal, taking it as something meaningful to besides to tell the story, besides the personal account, as reflecting the overall changes and all the data that you gave us. It was very, very informative. I think that many of us know some scattered facts, information, but presenting it in one holistic, systemic manner is truly enriching and important for all of us. We do have a few minutes for Q&A, so if anybody here wants to raise a question, if not, I think maybe we can just sit. Yeah, let's just sit for 6-7 minutes. You have your mic. So I will want to ask you perhaps to reflect on the sense that many of us have with the background of what you just presented, the long way that we've come through in such a small amount of time, and you emphasized it a number of times through your talk, that it's just a question of one generation and how far we've got. Many of us feel that we are now in an era of setbacks and backlash and hope that was when Me Too movement started. I think some of us, and I've heard it, and I personally also share this sense, is that it turned into only strengthening and increasing backlash. And it is tied with the rise of populist regimes throughout the world and increasing power of churches and, well, I want to hear your intake on that, particularly from the perspective of somebody who's also working vis-a-vis religious powers in the U.S.
I guess that's on, yeah? Well, I don't know. It's a hard question. I mean, I'm often accused of being a Pollyanna. I know it's true. But I tend to be very positive about things getting done. So Utah was a kind of surprising start for even this question of respecting women's autonomy, given its demographics, overwhelmingly Mormon, very religious. But we engaged in a kind of concerted effort. So when there was a decision made to do an op-ed, then basically we started running a media campaign. And a lawmaker was sitting at breakfast, the one who sponsored this bill with his wife. And one of the reporters that I knew for the Deseret News had done a story on medical ethics that was this story. And she literally hands the newspaper to him and says, "This needs to change." That's the reason he ran this bill, because his wife's like, "What is this?" So I think sometimes there can be things that affirm the status of women or minorities or vulnerable persons, but they come from surprising allies. And they might come from not just a progressive sense, right? Maybe the people in Utah, for them it was more about proprietariness or thinking about their daughter, this happening to their daughter, God forbid it happens to anybody, but not my daughter. Well, fine. I don't care why you changed this law to make it respectful of women, if it's because you're concerned for your daughter or your wife, or because you're concerned or speak about it as a human right, or speak about it in very progressive terms. In fact, it's helpful to me if you can get the left and the right both to come to the same middle place, which is a place of respecting all people, and all you're asking them to do is to move from their priors. And our priors are different, but often we can come to the same place. And I think with these issues which divide us as a country, especially my country, people start in very different places, and then we give up on each other because we're polarized. Because we, you know, the people who have supported this bill, for example, in Maryland and Delaware and New York, I don't think are sitting at a dinner table with the same people who supported it in Utah for the most part. They have very different conceptions of the world. But they still could come around the same idea and make it real and tangible as a kind of progress. I don't know if that helps.
But the question is whether there are limits to this optimistic strategy. Take, for example, reproductive rights, abortion rights. I mean, do you foresee the same dynamic and the same pattern feasible around this controversy?
Well, in the United States, we'll never be rid of abortion as a controversy. We now have young evangelicals, and this is all Pew data. I'm not trying to trash evangelicals at all. But the Pew data would suggest that people are self-defining in their communities of faith around opposition to abortion. And once that happens, in fact, in my own work, I've shown that the people in the United States have become more divided over abortion since Roe v. Wade than they were at the time of Roe. And that at the time of Roe, Guttmacher and other statistics show that people were much more willing to allow and make accommodation for abortion in cases of incest and rape than they would be now. So I think that's deeply problematic. But to anchor it a little bit to how far we've come and how far we have yet to go, I think sometimes how far we've come, suffrage, even changing the Constitution, okay, is a huge climb in my country. But it's a milestone you can hit because it's defined and it's in front of you. When you look at the limitations, how far we have yet to go, these are very difficult problems because you're navigating, for example, egos in a family. Look at the pay study I showed you, right? You know, whether in people's mental maps, men should make more money than women. That's going to take a whole lot of change. That will take generations for people to change their mind about that, if they ever change their mind about that. That's not a discrete milestone. And so to some extent, I think you're dealing with the muddy part of change now. And it's very systemic and culturally driven. In other words, you know, you need to change culture in order to change some of this in terms of the progress of women.
And the next conference that we need to make, I think, is about education, because that's where you're ending, I think, headed to. So there is a lot to do, and I think we... Oh, please, Ronit. Yes.
So thank you very much. I just want to ask from the perspective of the century, can you evaluate what would be a better strategies to advancing a more feminist insight within society?
The question is what's a better strategy for advancing a sort of feminist, equal status of women. Look, I think some of this can be a litigation strategy, right? So some of it's legislative. These bans on pelvic exams without consent, that's legislative, but it's small, it's discrete. We have legislation in the United States that's already guaranteeing people equal pay, but it's constructed in such a way that people can't succeed on those, generally can't succeed in enforcing what is a stated norm. So I think to some degree, Probably out of everything that I've shown, the single most constructive thing is that sponsorship muscle. I think it's the thing that we all have within our power. I think it's something that we can act on today. And I'll just give you a good example. One of my friends is in the House of Lords, and she recently was at my university, and I asked her to speak to the Women Law Student Association, because how many, of our young women have spoken to a woman in the House of Lords, or for that matter in Congress, right, or any other place. And one thing that Ruth said that I thought was really, really powerful, we started to ask about what is the thing that she has done to try to help other women. And she says that when she gets a call from headhunters or people looking for recommendations of people to consider for a job, that she only gives the name of women. And that stopped me in my tracks, because I don't do that. I always look at my student who worked with me, my research assistant, and I'm very, very good about that. I'm always pushing my research assistants. But it stopped me and made me really think to myself, maybe that's not fair. Maybe I do need to be actively trying to push just women. I don't know. But the fact that she did that, she's a good illustration of that sponsorship muscle. And I think that's one thing where women can reach back and grab other people and pull them forward.
I think that's very close to home, this sponsorship muscle or mentoring in academia. We all know it all too well. Last question over there? Yes.
Okay, so that's a fair critique. So the question or the comment is that this was focused on women. So just one piece of that is I understood that to be my task today. So that's part one. Part two, in some of that data you see intersectionality, and you're absolutely right to talk about intersectionality. So the women who were not coming out the back end of that pipeline were black women. Right? Women of color in particular, taking a double hit for being women and for being people of color. And we should all recognize that. Now, in our country, the number of people who, for example, are trans is a very, very small fraction. It's 0.06 of the entire population. I've spent a lot of my life, but especially the last 5 years, working to get the full LGBT community, _T, protected from discrimination in the United States. So I'm going to be the last person in this room to forget trans people or other identities. But I just didn't understand it to be part of what I was doing. Now, I do think that, what I was doing today. So I do think, though, that we need to talk openly about intersectionality every time that the data or the problem put in front of us poses that. And the reason, and I'll give you one example in the pelvic exam context. When I first started working on this project, it was because I was a member of a statewide hospital ethics consortium where you could come and give advice, come and seek advice. And a young medical student, a woman, came to me and said, or came to this group and said, I'm being asked to do pelvic exams on women under anesthesia, and they haven't consented as far as we know. And at the time, which was now like 18 years ago, I thought, no, surely that cannot be true. She misunderstands the problem, because we've had biomedical ethics at that time for about 30 years. Turns out she did not misunderstand the problem. That led me then to talking to the heads. I interviewed 16 faculty at 10 major teaching institutions across the United States. And one place where I was completely floored was a department chair, a man, of an OBGYN department, saying that they were using women under anesthesia to teach normal anatomy, just like happened to the woman in the Chicago Tribune. And I said, why in the world would you do that? You have gynecological teaching associates, and you just need to, they pay like $5,000, $6,000 a semester for them to be taught upon. And he says to me, who's going to pay for that? That is just complete power. There was actually an alternative that would have better suited the needs of their students, because part of what you're learning in this context is how to communicate. You're learning how to palpate someone while talking to them and looking them in the eye. Can't do that with an anesthetized patient. Second thing that came to my attention, which also is not just about power, but about the implications for people of color, in particular, was one of the institutions was doing unconsented to pelvic exams for teaching purposes only on patients in their low-income clinic. Read African American. But if you had the money or the insurance status to be seen at a different part of the very same hospital, then you were asked. Now that's wrong. That's absolutely wrong. We should not be disproportionately, if there is a cost of medical education here, it should be borne by all of us in like measure, because we all benefit from it, not from a subsection of people who don't have power, don't have financial wherewithal to make any other choice. So I can't agree with you more about intersectionality and especially about power dynamic. And again, I just thought I was charged here to talk mostly about the status of women.
And I'll just repeat that you're welcome to come on Sunday afternoon when Robin will discuss other parts of her activist work and legislative work on non-binary issues, on LGBT rights mostly. So I'm sure it will give us another much larger perspective. And let me just conclude by expressing my honest admiration for all the work that you do and the successes that you have, and for being Pollyanna, for being optimistic, and for raising hopes that change, even if it is slow, it does come, it can come, and it will come. So with this, just ask a big and the next session.